Welcome to Frema Audiobooks, where powerful minds sharpen their voices, where communication becomes influence, and where your ability to speak with precision, confidence, and psychological intelligence transforms every room you enter. As we explore the strategic wisdom in how to speak smart, master the psychology of powerful communication. In this audiobook-style journey, you will learn how smart communicators think before they speak, how they listen beyond words, and how they use the psychology of human behavior to command respect effortlessly. You will understand how powerful communication is not about speaking more, but speaking with intention, clarity, and emotional direction. Throughout this experience, you will be guided through the principles that make people captivating, persuasive, and unforgettable when they express themselves. You will discover how tone, silence, timing, and emotional awareness can shift conversations in your favor with minimal effort. You will learn why people respond to confidence, how influence is built through presence, and how smart communicators lead conversations without force or aggression. This message will show you how to speak in ways that make people listen, trust, and remember your words long after the moment has passed. You will gain insight into how to choose language that creates impact, how to avoid communication habits that weaken your authority, and how to use psychology to anchor your message deeply in people's minds. You will learn the keys to being articulate, calm under pressure, and respected in every setting. You will uncover how powerful communicators maintain composure, how they control conversations subtly, and how they express themselves with clarity, even in difficult moments. This journey will teach you to speak with intention instead of reacting, to communicate with intelligence instead of emotion, and to guide conversations with purpose instead of guessing. When you master communication, you don't just speak better, you think better, connect better, lead better, and elevate every relationship you touch. And before we begin, make sure you subscribe to Frema Audiobooks. Like this video, comment your biggest takeaway, and share this message with someone who wants to become a smarter, sharper, more powerful communicator. Your transformation into a high-level speaker begins right now. You elevate your communication power when you understand that speaking smart begins long before the first word leaves your mouth, because preparation shapes clarity, clarity shapes confidence, and confidence shapes the impact your voice will carry. You grow in intelligence when you gather your thoughts before expressing them. You elevate your presence when you enter conversations with intention instead of impulse. You gain psychological advantage when you know what message you want to deliver. You rise in influence when you communicate with purpose instead of rambling. You elevate your composure when your mind is structured. You grow in authority when people sense that your words are not accidental. You gain respect when you speak with direction. You rise in confidence when you trust your preparation. You elevate your clarity when your message is mentally organized. You grow in emotional control when you speak from focus rather than reaction. You gain persuasive strength when your structure makes you easy to follow. You rise in conversational dominance when your ideas flow seamlessly. You elevate your identity when smart communication becomes your natural baseline. You win every day when you prepare your mind before you prepare your words. You speak smart when you master the psychology of listening, because listening gives you access to information people reveal unconsciously and gives you the advantage of shaping the conversation with precision. You grow in influence when you respond to what people truly mean instead of what they superficially say. You elevate your intelligence when you listen for patterns, tone, and emotional cues. You gain control when you gather information before expressing your opinion. You rise in strength when silence becomes your strategy. You elevate your presence when people realize you are fully attentive. You grow in wisdom when you listen more than you speak. You gain trust when people feel heard and understood. You rise in clarity when you interpret meaning behind the words. You elevate your communication when listening becomes your greatest tool. You grow in emotional intelligence when you understand unspoken signals. You gain conversational power when you speak from awareness, not assumption. You rise in mastery when listening guides your responses. You elevate your influence when people naturally open up around you. You win every day when your ears make you smarter than your mouth. You elevate your communication impact when you learn how to use tone strategically, because tone communicates emotion, authority, and intention long before your words do. You grow in confidence when your tone matches your message. You elevate your presence when your tone carries steadiness. You gain authority when your voice reflects certainty. You rise in influence when your tone conveys calm power. You elevate your charisma when your tone becomes warm, engaging, and controlled. You grow in persuasion when tone amplifies meaning. You gain clarity when your voice is intentional. You rise in emotional intelligence when you adjust tone to the moment. You elevate your relational skills when your tone builds connection instead of tension. You grow in magnetic presence when tone strengthens your communication identity. You gain strength when your voice never cracks under pressure. You rise in mastery when tone becomes part of your strategy. You elevate your communication when your tone speaks before your words. You win every day when your voice sets the emotional temperature of every conversation. You speak at a higher level when you understand the psychology of pausing, because the pause is one of the most powerful tools of smart communication, influencing attention, tension, clarity, and authority. You grow in control when you refuse to rush your speech. You elevate your influence when your pauses command attention. You gain strategic advantage when silence increases the weight of your words. You rise in authority when people lean in to hear what comes next. You elevate your clarity when pauses give you time to think. You grow in presence when silence highlights your confidence. You gain persuasive power when pauses emphasize key ideas. You rise in emotional steadiness when you do not fear conversational silence. You elevate your identity when your pauses show composure. You grow in mastery when you speak with deliberate rhythm. You gain dominance when your silence outperforms someone else's noise. You rise in intellectual presence when your pacing reflects intelligence. You elevate your communication when the pause becomes your signature weapon. You win every day when silence strengthens your message. You elevate your communication intelligence when you learn how to choose words that influence, because smart speakers understand that language shapes perception, perception shapes emotion, and emotion shapes decision-making. You grow in precision when your vocabulary becomes intentional. You elevate your impact when your word choice reflects clarity. You gain persuasive strength when you speak with simplicity and depth. You rise in authority when your words demonstrate understanding. You elevate your credibility when your language is confident and concise. You grow in emotional intelligence when you use words that calm rather than inflame. You gain influence when your language paints vivid meaning. You rise in respect when your words carry thoughtfulness. You elevate your strategy when your phrasing increases receptivity. You grow in communication power when you select words that align with your audience's psychology. You gain trust when your words feel genuine. You rise in connection when your vocabulary builds rapport. You elevate your presence when your language elevates others. You win every day when your words are chosen with intention. You elevate your communication influence when you learn how to read emotional temperature in a conversation, because smart speakers understand that emotions dictate receptivity, and controlling the emotional climate allows you to guide the interaction naturally. You grow in emotional intelligence when you identify tension before it escalates. You elevate your presence when you adjust your delivery to match the moment. You gain strategic advantage when you speak only when the emotional environment supports your message. You rise in influence when you choose calmness over confrontation. You elevate your clarity when your responses match the emotional tone accurately. You grow in connection when you acknowledge emotions without being controlled by them. You gain power when you stay steady while others fluctuate. You rise in communication mastery when emotional awareness shapes your timing. You elevate your rapport when people feel emotionally understood. You grow in conversational leadership when you stabilize the room. You gain depth when your communication reflects both intellect and empathy. You rise in control when you protect the emotional flow of dialogue. You elevate your results when you direct conversations with emotional precision. You win every day when you read the room intelligently. You speak smart when you stop interrupting, because interruptions signal insecurity, impatience, and lack of control, while allowing others to finish enhances your authority, listening skills, and perceived intelligence. You grow in presence when you let people complete their thoughts. You elevate your charisma when you make others feel valued. You gain influence when you allow conversations to unfold naturally. You rise in strategic communication when you gather more information through patience. You elevate your intelligence when you speak after hearing the full context. You grow in power when you show that you don't need to dominate conversations. You gain respect when your listening shows restraint. You rise in conversational grace when interruptions disappear from your habits. You elevate your clarity when you respond with full understanding. You grow in psychological awareness when you notice how people open up when uninterrupted. You gain authority when your calmness contrasts others' impulsiveness. You rise in charm when people feel heard in your presence. You elevate your confidence when you speak less but mean more. You win every day when you stop interrupting and start listening. You strengthen your communication power when you learn to ask smart, precise questions, because questions guide conversations, reveal intentions, uncover truth, and position you as the thinker, not the talker. You grow in intelligence when your questions create clarity. You elevate your authority when you ask questions that make others think deeper. You gain influence when your curiosity is strategic. You rise in presence when your questions shape the direction of discussion. You elevate your connection when questions make people feel understood. You grow in insight when your questions reveal hidden motives. You gain power when questions expose inconsistencies gently. You rise in respect when your inquiries show wisdom. You elevate your impact when questions strengthen the dialogue. You grow in emotional intelligence when you ask questions that ease tension. You gain trust when your questioning style feels compassionate, not interrogative. You rise in control when questions redirect conversations. You elevate your communication when your questions hold intentional weight. You win every day when your questions become sharper than your statements. You elevate your communication mastery when you learn to slow down your speech, because speaking slowly conveys certainty, intelligence, and confidence, while rushing signals insecurity, fear, and loss of control. You grow in clarity when your words land cleanly. You elevate your authority when people feel your composure through your pacing. You gain respect when you speak calmly under pressure. You rise in influence when you use pace to control the environment. You elevate your presence when your voice carries quiet strength. You grow in intentionality when every sentence has room to resonate. You gain psychological advantage when slow delivery forces others to listen. You rise in communication precision when your pace matches your message. You elevate your understanding when slow speech helps you think clearly. You grow in emotional steadiness when rushing disappears from your habits. You gain control when your pacing becomes deliberate. You rise in charisma when your voice feels grounded and confident. You elevate your impact when your pace conveys intelligence. You win every day when slow, calm speech becomes your default. You elevate your communication intelligence when you understand the power of framing, because framing shapes perception, and perception determines how people interpret your message, your intentions, and your authority. You grow in strategy when you choose the context before the content. You elevate your influence when you position ideas in a way that aligns with people's motivations. You gain persuasion when your framing sets the emotional tone. You rise in clarity when framing prevents misunderstanding. You elevate your presence when your words shape how conversations move. You grow in psychological insight when you guide interpretations consciously. You gain power when you frame ideas in ways that encourage agreement. You rise in authority when you lead the narrative. You elevate your communication when framing turns complex ideas into accessible meaning. You grow in connection when your framing resonates with people's values. You gain momentum when framing eliminates resistance. You rise in impact when your message becomes easier to accept. You elevate your speaking skills when framing becomes instinctive. You win every day when you control how your message is perceived. You elevate your communication presence when you learn how to control your facial expressions, because expressions speak louder than words and often communicate your emotional truth before you even open your mouth. You grow in emotional professionalism when your face remains composed under tension. You elevate your authority when your expression reflects calm intelligence. You gain credibility when your expression aligns with your message. You rise in influence when your face remains steady even during conflict. You elevate your communication when your expression signals clarity and confidence. You grow in self-awareness when you recognize how your face shapes interpretation. You gain emotional control when you protect your micro-expressions. You rise in persuasion when your face conveys openness, warmth, or seriousness intentionally. You elevate your listening presence when your expression shows genuine interest. You grow in leadership when your face communicates steadiness in stressful moments. You gain respect when your expression remains neutral instead of reactive. You rise in charisma when your face reinforces your words. You elevate your psychology of influence when you master expression control. You win every day when your face supports your message instead of exposing your emotions. You speak smart when you match your message to your audience, because communication is not one size fits all, and powerful communicators adapt their delivery to the mindset, knowledge, and emotional needs of the person in front of them. You grow in influence when you tailor your language intentionally. You elevate your connection when people feel you truly understand them. You gain persuasive strength when your message aligns with their worldview. You rise in communication mastery when you adjust complexity based on their familiarity. You elevate your intelligence when you avoid unnecessary jargon. You grow in emotional awareness when you communicate at their level without condescension. You gain respect when people see you as relatable and clear. You rise in authority when your communication feels accessible. You elevate your impact when your message becomes easier to absorb. You grow in communication versatility when you shift effortlessly between styles. You gain trust when your adaptability shows that you value the listener. You rise in leadership when your communication brings clarity instead of confusion. You elevate your influence when you speak to people in the language they understand best. You win every day when your communication matches your audience perfectly. You elevate your communication psychology when you understand how to use body language intentionally, because your posture, gestures, and presence can double the power of your words or completely undermine them. You grow in confidence when your posture communicates strength. You elevate your influence when your body language signals certainty. You gain clarity when your gestures support your message. You rise in presence when your body language reflects leadership. You elevate your authority when you take up space comfortably. You grow in charisma when your movements feel purposeful. You gain persuasive power when your body reinforces your verbal message. You rise in emotional intelligence when you read others' body language accurately. You elevate your connection when your posture feels approachable rather than closed. You grow in communication sharpness when you eliminate nervous habits. You gain steadiness when your body becomes calm and controlled. You rise in mastery when your presence speaks before your words. You elevate your reputation when your body language matches your confidence. You win every day when your posture amplifies your power. You speak with higher intelligence when you learn to remove filler words, because fillers drain credibility, weaken clarity, and signal uncertainty, while clean speech signals precision, confidence, and authority. You grow in awareness when you catch yourself before saying like, or you know. You elevate your professionalism when your speech becomes crisp. You gain respect when your sentences are complete and intentional. You rise in presence when filler-free speech draws attention. You elevate your articulation when your delivery becomes smoother. You grow in confidence when your words stand on their own. You gain clarity when your message becomes easier to follow. You rise in influence when people trust the strength of your voice. You elevate your intellectual presence when your speech feels polished. You grow in communication discipline when filler words disappear. You gain psychological advantage when you sound composed and prepared. You rise in impact when every word contributes meaning. You elevate your identity when your speech reflects intelligence. You win every day when fillers fade from your vocabulary. You elevate your communication elegance when you learn the art of finishing your sentences cleanly, because unfinished thoughts create confusion, weaken authority, and prevent your message from landing with full weight. You grow in clarity when your sentences reach thoughtful conclusions. You elevate your articulation when your communication becomes complete. You gain persuasion when every statement feels intentional. You rise in confidence when you no longer trail off or fade out. You elevate your authority when your speech feels structured and precise. You grow in control when you deliver full, meaningful thoughts. You gain respect when people understand exactly what you meant. You rise in intelligence when your ideas connect smoothly. You elevate your impact when your message feels whole. You grow in influence when your finishing statements strengthen your credibility. You gain psychological presence when you resolve your thoughts instead of abandoning them mid-sentence. You rise in leadership when your communication inspires clarity. You elevate your expression when your sentences carry finality. You win every day when your thoughts are polished from beginning to end. You elevate your communication sharpness when you learn how to manage your emotional state before speaking, because emotional stability determines the quality, clarity, and intelligence of every message you deliver. You grow in composure when you check your emotions before responding. You elevate your influence when calmness shapes your tone. You gain respect when you refuse to speak from frustration or defensiveness. You rise in clarity when your emotions never dilute your meaning. You elevate your authority when your words feel grounded and measured. You grow in discipline when you pause before reacting. You gain persuasion when emotional steadiness enhances your credibility. You rise in psychological strength when you choose logic over impulse. You elevate your communication when emotional maturity guides your delivery. You grow in impact when your calm presence elevates the entire conversation. You gain control when you resist emotional triggers. You rise in intelligence when your message is not distorted by mood. You elevate your aura when your emotional steadiness becomes noticeable. You win every day when emotional control shapes your speech. You speak smart when you understand the strategic power of storytelling, because stories activate emotion, memory, and imagination, making your message more influential, relatable, and unforgettable. You grow in persuasion when you use stories to simplify complex ideas. You elevate your charisma when your storytelling draws people in. You gain connection when your stories resonate with others' experiences. You rise in emotional intelligence when your stories hold purpose. You elevate your influence when your stories inspire reflection. You grow in credibility when your stories reinforce your expertise. You gain attention when people follow your narrative naturally. You rise in impact when your stories leave a lasting impression. You elevate your communication when storytelling becomes your delivery strength. You grow in leadership when your stories motivate and guide others. You gain trust when your stories reveal authenticity. You rise in relatability when your stories show vulnerability without weakness. You elevate your effectiveness when stories make your message come alive. You win every day when storytelling enhances your voice, You elevate your psychological communication power when you learn to use contrast, because contrast highlights differences, clarifies direction, and strengthens the emotional effect of your message. You grow in precision when you show what something is by showing what it is not. You elevate your clarity when contrast sharpens understanding. You gain persuasion when contrast reveals consequences. You rise in influence when you present choices vividly. You elevate your presence when contrast turns your message into a mental picture. You grow in intellectual depth when you use contrast to structure ideas. You gain control when contrast guides people logically. You rise in communication strength when contrast makes your statements memorable. You elevate your articulation when contrast brings balance to your message. You grow in strategic delivery when you use contrast to highlight value. You gain trust when contrast shows honesty instead of manipulation. You rise in mastery when your message feels complete from both sides. You elevate your communication when contrast becomes a framing tool. You win every day when contrast clarifies your point effortlessly. You elevate your communication intelligence when you learn to master transitions, because smooth transitions keep conversations flowing, ideas connected, and listeners engaged from beginning to end. You grow in clarity when your thoughts connect logically. You elevate your professionalism when transitions make you sound polished. You gain influence when your communication flows without interruption. You rise in structure when your transitions guide the listener easily. You elevate your articulation when every idea leads naturally into the next. You grow in communication elegance when transitions eliminate confusion. You gain persuasion when smooth delivery increases trust. You rise in impact when your message unfolds seamlessly. You elevate your listening experience when you guide people from point to point gracefully. You grow in conversational leadership when you prevent fragmentation. You gain credibility when transitions enhance the coherence of your message. You rise in mastery when your transitions feel effortless. You elevate your authority when you speak like someone who knows where the conversation is going. You win every day when transitions strengthen your message. You speak with strategic intelligence when you learn to simplify complex ideas. Because simplicity does not weaken your communication, it strengthens it by making your message digestible, memorable, and accessible to everyone. You grow in clarity when you reduce unnecessary complexity. You elevate your intelligence when you explain difficult concepts in an easy way. You gain respect when you make people feel smarter, not confused. You rise in communication power when your simplicity increases understanding. You elevate your influence when your message becomes repeatable. You grow in emotional awareness when you adjust your delivery to avoid overwhelm. You gain persuasive advantage when simplicity improves engagement. You rise in authority when people appreciate your ability to teach clearly. You elevate your confidence when simplicity makes your delivery seamless. You grow in connection when your message becomes accessible to all listeners. You gain credibility when your clarity outshines complexity. You rise in effectiveness when simplicity increases retention. You elevate your communication when your ideas land cleanly. You win every day when simplicity becomes your strategic advantage. You elevate your communication mastery when you understand that confidence is not about being loud, dominant, or forceful, but about speaking with grounded certainty that comes from knowing your value and trusting your mind. You grow in authority when your confidence shows in your calmness. You elevate your presence when your confidence comes from preparation, not ego. You gain influence when your confidence makes others feel secure. You rise in clarity when confidence sharpens your message. You elevate your intelligence when you speak from steadiness instead of insecurity. You grow in strength when your confidence is quiet, not reactive. You gain respect when your tone reflects certainty without arrogance. You rise in psychological presence when people sense your self-belief. You elevate your charisma when confidence shapes your energy. You grow in credibility when confidence aligns with competence. You gain power when confidence guides your delivery. You rise in communication leadership when confidence becomes your foundation. You elevate your identity when confidence becomes part of your voice. You win every day when you speak with confidence rooted in clarity and preparation. Rise in authority when your timing shows awareness. You elevate your clarity when you deliver your message at the exact moment listeners are most receptive. You grow in emotional strategy when timing becomes intentional. You gain persuasion when you pause until the room is ready. You rise in effectiveness when you speak after listening fully. You elevate your presence when your timing reveals patience. You grow in composure when you wait instead of rushing. You gain power when your timing creates emphasis. You rise in communication mastery when your timing enhances understanding. You elevate your impact when your words arrive at the right moment. You win every day when your timing strengthens your message. You elevate your communication intelligence when you learn how to acknowledge others properly, because acknowledgement makes people feel seen, respected, and valued, allowing your conversations to flow with trust and cooperation. You grow in connection when you validate others' contributions. You elevate your emotional intelligence when your acknowledgement reflects understanding. You gain influence when people feel respected in your presence. You rise in communication leadership when acknowledgement strengthens relationships. You elevate your listening power when you reflect back key points. You grow in clarity when acknowledgement prevents misinterpretations. You gain trust when your acknowledgement feels genuine. You rise in authority when you respect others' viewpoints. You elevate your presence when acknowledgement becomes part of your style. You grow in conversational harmony when validation makes dialogue smoother. You gain persuasive strength when acknowledgement softens resistance. You rise in rapport building when acknowledgement encourages openness. You elevate your charisma when people enjoy speaking with you. You win every day when acknowledgement strengthens your influence. You speak with higher intelligence when you learn to control your reactions, because reacting emotionally weakens your communication, while responding thoughtfully strengthens your credibility, tone, and overall message. You grow in maturity when you process your feelings before speaking. You elevate your stability when reactions no longer guide your words. You gain influence when your responses carry composure. You rise in clarity when your emotions don't cloud your meaning. You elevate your authority when your voice stays steady. You grow in professionalism when your reactions are disciplined. You gain persuasion when you speak from logic. You rise in presence when emotional triggers lose their power. You elevate your communication when your responses reflect intelligence. You grow in emotional intelligence when you understand your triggers. You gain control when you separate immediate reactions from intentional responses. You rise in self-awareness when you regulate your tone. You elevate your strength when your communication reflects discipline. You win every day when your responses are smart instead of reactive. You elevate your communication impact when you learn how to end your statements with strength, because powerful endings leave lasting impressions. Finalize your message and reinforce your authority every time you speak. You grow in clarity when your conclusions summarize your point effectively. You elevate your presence when your final words carry weight. You gain persuasion when strong endings strengthen understanding. You rise in confidence when you finish with certainty. You elevate your influence when your message concludes decisively. You grow in professionalism when your endings feel polished. You gain respect when your conclusions demonstrate control. You rise in impact when your final words resonate. You elevate your communication when you reinforce your intention at the end. You grow in structure when your statements feel complete. You gain strategic advantage when your conclusions guide the listener's perception. You rise in mastery when your endings become memorable. You elevate your authority when you close conversations with intelligence. You win every day when your words end with power. You elevate your communication influence when you learn the psychology of mirroring, because mirroring subtly builds rapport, increases trust, and makes people feel naturally connected to you without them realizing why. You grow in emotional intelligence when you mirror tone instead of copying words. You elevate your presence when your energy matches the person you're communicating with. You gain relational power when mirroring creates subconscious comfort. You rise in connection when people feel understood without explanation. You elevate your adaptability when you adjust your pace to their pace. You grow in influence when mirroring softens resistance. You gain strategic communication strength when mirroring encourages openness. You rise in credibility when mirroring makes you relatable. You elevate your persuasion when mirroring builds conversational harmony. You grow in control when you mirror calmly instead of reacting emotionally. You gain intuitive insight when mirroring reveals subtle intentions. You rise in communication mastery when mirroring becomes intentional rather than accidental. You elevate your charisma when mirroring strengthens human connection effortlessly. You win every day when mirroring adds quiet power to your communication. You speak smart when you understand how to use positive reinforcement effectively, because people respond more strongly to encouragement than criticism. And reinforcing good behavior strengthens relationships and improves cooperation. You grow in communicative influence when you praise what you want to see more of. You elevate your emotional intelligence when your reinforcement feels sincere. You gain leadership power when encouragement motivates others. You rise in communication harmony when positive reinforcement reduces defensiveness. You elevate your clarity when your reinforcement is specific and meaningful. You grow in trust building when your praise is thoughtful. You gain relational strength when reinforcement inspires loyalty. You rise in influence when positivity drives engagement. You elevate your communication identity when your voice uplifts others. You grow in persuasion when reinforcement increases receptivity. You gain stability when positivity becomes your conversational foundation. You rise in authority when praise enhances cooperation. You elevate your aura when your communication feels empowering instead of critical. You win every day when positive reinforcement becomes your tool for influence. You elevate your communication intelligence when you understand how to handle difficult conversations with precision, because difficult discussions reveal your strength, emotional control, and ability to lead with clarity, even under tension. You grow in maturity when you approach tough topics calmly. You elevate your authority when you speak honestly without aggression. You gain emotional intelligence when you separate facts from feelings. You rise in communication strength when you address problems directly. You elevate your composure when you avoid blame and focus on solutions. You grow in credibility when your tone stays balanced. You gain trust when difficult conversations feel fair and respectful. You rise in persuasion when you express disagreement without hostility. You elevate your influence when you keep your message grounded in clarity. You grow in wisdom when you stay focused on resolution instead of escalating conflict. You gain relational stability when you approach difficult topics thoughtfully. You rise in leadership when you remain steady during uncomfortable moments. You elevate your identity when difficult conversations reveal your maturity. You win every day when challenges strengthen your communication instead of breaking it. You speak smart when you learn how to guide group conversations, because group dynamics require clarity, structure, and presence to maintain respect, flow, and engagement from multiple minds at once. You grow in authority when you set the tone early. You elevate your leadership when you maintain order with calm direction. You gain crowd influence when your voice feels centered and composed. You rise in communication presence when people naturally follow your lead. You elevate your strength when you prevent conversation chaos. You grow in relational intelligence when you ensure everyone feels included. You gain structure when you guide discussions with purpose. You rise in clarity when your direction keeps the group focused. You elevate your charisma when your confidence stabilizes the room. You grow in professional presence when groups respect your communication style. You gain persuasion when your guidance feels natural instead of forceful. You rise in mastery when group conversations become seamless under your direction. You elevate your impact when you lead groups with intelligence. You win every day when you guide group dialogue with ease. You elevate your communication personality when you learn the psychology of humor, because humor, when used intelligently, builds connection, lowers tension, and enhances your likability without undermining your professionalism. You grow in charm when humor creates warmth. You elevate your social intelligence when your humor fits the audience. You gain influence when laughter strengthens rapport. You rise in charisma when humor makes you approachable. You elevate your presence when humor lightens emotional intensity. You grow in conversational ease when humor breaks stiffness. You gain psychological advantage when humor disarms defensiveness. You rise in communication agility when humor shifts the energy smoothly. You elevate your relatability when humor bridges differences. You grow in creativity when humor enhances expression. You gain connection when humor opens people up. You rise in memorability when humor makes conversations enjoyable. You elevate your impact when your humor feels natural, clever, and well-timed. You win every day when humor becomes a tool, not a crutch, in your communication. You elevate your communication intelligence when you learn to articulate boundaries clearly, because vague boundaries create confusion, while precise boundaries create respect, clarity, and emotional safety. You grow in strength when you express limits without hostility. You elevate your authority when your boundaries are communicated calmly and firmly. You gain trust when people understand exactly what you expect. You rise in clarity when your boundaries prevent misunderstandings. You elevate your presence when you maintain composure while asserting yourself. You grow in emotional maturity when your boundaries protect your well-being. You gain psychological advantage when your limits are consistent. You rise in influence when people know how to communicate with you effectively. You elevate your relationships when boundaries improve communication flow. You grow in confidence when you stand behind your limits. You gain stability when boundaries create structure in your conversations. You rise in intelligence when your boundaries reflect self-respect. You elevate your interactions when boundaries lead to healthier dialogue. You win every day when your boundaries communicate who you are without needing explanation. You speak with sharper intelligence when you master the use of emotional labeling, because labeling emotions helps people feel understood, reduces defensiveness, and opens the door to deeper, more productive conversations. You grow in empathy when you acknowledge what someone might be feeling. You elevate your communication when labeling calms emotional intensity. You gain connection when people feel seen through your words. You rise in influence when you use emotional labeling to build trust. You elevate your relational power when labeling encourages vulnerability. You grow in psychological awareness when you identify emotional shifts. You gain persuasion when labeling makes people more receptive. You rise in grace when you validate emotions without judgment. You elevate your presence when emotional labeling deepens rapport. You grow in clarity when you distinguish emotions from actions. You gain stability when labeling prevents emotional confusion. You rise in maturity when you help others feel grounded. You elevate your communication mastery when emotional labeling becomes natural. You win every day when labeling emotions strengthens the bond between you and the listener. You elevate your conversational intelligence when you learn to redirect discussions smoothly, because redirection keeps conversations productive, prevents unnecessary escalation, and demonstrates your ability to guide dialogue with precision. You grow in influence when you steer conversations away from unproductive territory. You elevate your authority when redirection feels seamless. You gain persuasion when you lead discussions with intention. You rise in clarity when redirection prevents confusion. You elevate your presence when people follow your conversational guidance. You grow in communication agility when you pivot with purpose. You gain control when you redirect without sounding dismissive. You rise in leadership when your direction improves the conversation. You elevate your adaptability when you shift smoothly between topics. You grow in emotional intelligence when redirection reduces tension. You gain respect when people see your ability to stay on track. You rise in mastery when every conversational turn feels deliberate. You elevate your influence when redirection becomes effortless. You win every day when you guide discussions instead of letting them drift. You elevate your communication presence when you understand how to use compliments strategically, because well-crafted compliments build goodwill, strengthen rapport, and increase collaboration, but only when done genuinely and intelligently. You grow in social intelligence when you give compliments that reflect sincerity. You elevate your charm when your compliments are thoughtful rather than generic. You gain relational strength when compliments feel personal and meaningful. You rise in influence when compliments encourage connection. You elevate your communication when your praise highlights genuine strengths. You grow in empathy when you notice the good in others. You gain cooperation when compliments foster positivity. You rise in emotional intelligence when your praise balances humility and confidence. You elevate your presence when your compliments are well-timed. You grow in charisma when your kindness elevates the conversation. You gain trust when your praise never feels manipulative. You rise in likability when your compliments show genuine appreciation. You elevate your psychological impact when your words uplift the listener. You win every day when your compliments strengthen relationships. You speak with strategic clarity when you master the psychology of repetition, because repetition reinforces memory, strengthens persuasion, and ensures the message sticks long after the conversation ends. You grow in influence when your key points are repeated with purpose. You elevate your communication when repetition enhances clarity rather than redundancy. You gain persuasive power when repetition becomes subtle and intentional. You rise in authority when people remember your message clearly. You elevate your message when repetition creates structure. You grow in delivery mastery when repetition supports retention. You gain credibility when your repeated points align with your core meaning. You rise in impact when your message echoes in people's minds. You elevate your communication when repetition enhances understanding. You grow in insight when you identify which ideas deserve repetition. You gain power when repetition strengthens emotional connection. You rise in intelligence when you repeat without sounding repetitive. You elevate your influence when your listeners remember what matters most. You win every day when repetition amplifies your voice. You elevate your psychological advantage in communication when you learn to stay calm under verbal pressure, because pressure exposes a person's emotional foundation, and your steady response signals strength, intelligence, and credibility, even when the environment becomes chaotic. You grow in authority when you refuse to be rattled by intense questions. You elevate your clarity when you keep your voice stable. You gain respect when your calmness outperforms someone else's aggression. You rise in emotional intelligence when you separate tone from intention. You elevate your mastery when pressure becomes just another variable handled gracefully. You grow in presence when you maintain poise while others escalate. You gain persuasive power when calmness reinforces your credibility. You rise in communication leadership when you set the emotional tone of the exchange. You elevate your composure when stress does not distort your message. You grow in confidence when you trust your ability to respond intelligently under pressure. You gain psychological strength when your calmness makes others slow down. You rise in influence when you handle pressure with elegance. You elevate your identity when steadiness becomes your default communication style. You win every day when pressure cannot disrupt your delivery. You speak with greater intelligence when you learn the art of summarizing, because summarization shows mastery, demonstrates understanding, and helps anchor the most important points clearly in the listener's mind. You grow in clarity when you condense ideas without losing meaning. You elevate your professionalism when your summaries feel polished and precise. You gain persuasion when your summaries reinforce key points. You rise in authority when your message feels purposeful. You elevate your presence when your communication becomes succinct. You grow in intellectual sharpness when you highlight what truly matters. You gain influence when your summaries bring structure to conversations. You rise in trustworthiness when people rely on you for clarity. You elevate your impact when your summaries make information easier to remember. You grow in communication efficiency when your summaries prevent confusion. You gain strategic advantage when you end discussions with a clear takeaway. You rise in mastery when summarization becomes second nature. You elevate your value when your summaries strengthen understanding. You win every day when your summaries make your communication unforgettable. You elevate your communication intelligence when you learn the psychology of agreement, because agreement when used strategically creates momentum, reduces resistance, and builds a powerful bridge between your message and the listener's mindset. You grow in influence when you find common ground naturally. You elevate your persuasion when agreement softens tension. You gain relational harmony when people feel aligned with you. You rise in communication mastery when agreement becomes a tool instead of a reflex. You elevate your emotional intelligence when agreement clarifies shared values. You grow in trust building when agreement increases cooperation. You gain strategic power when agreement reframes disagreements constructively. You rise in leadership when your communication unites rather than divides. You elevate your clarity when you agree with the parts that matter. You grow in adaptability when agreement opens doors for deeper dialogue. You gain authority when agreement makes people more receptive. You rise in connection when alignment strengthens rapport. You elevate your conversational flow when agreement makes people feel safe. You win every day when agreement enhances your influence. You elevate your communication power when you learn to speak from your center, because centered communication comes from confidence, mindfulness, and internal stability, making your message more controlled, thoughtful, and magnetic to the listener. You grow in emotional balance when you stay grounded before speaking. You elevate your presence when your energy feels collected. You gain authority when your words come from composure. You rise in clarity when your mind stays organized. You elevate your tone when your delivery remains steady. You grow in psychological strength when your emotions do not hijack your speech. You gain influence when people sense inner strength behind your words. You rise in credibility when your centeredness commands attention. You elevate your communication when calmness becomes your anchor. You grow in consistency when you speak from grounded awareness. You gain respect when you communicate with inner stability. You rise in power when your calm tone controls the direction of the dialogue. You elevate your relational intelligence when centeredness improves your listening. You win every day when your communication is guided by stability, not impulse. You speak with elite-level intelligence when you learn to remove ego from your communication, because ego disrupts clarity, blocks connection, and creates unnecessary tension, while humility enhances influence, understanding, and cooperation. You grow in wisdom when you prioritize clarity over winning. You elevate your communication when your intentions remain pure. You gain power when your ego does not interfere with your message. You rise in emotional intelligence when humility sharpens your delivery. You elevate your presence when people feel respected instead of challenged. You grow in persuasion when your role shifts from competing to connecting. You gain trust when you communicate without self-centered motives. You rise in relational stability when ego no longer dictates your tone. You elevate your impact when your humility amplifies your authenticity. You grow in strategic strength when ego-free communication reduces resistance. You gain respect when your actions reflect emotional maturity. You rise in mastery when ego cannot shape your words. You elevate your identity when humility becomes a signature part of your speaking style. You win every day when ego-free communication elevates your influence. You rise into powerful communication mastery when you understand that speaking smart is not about speaking more, it is about speaking with intention, psychological awareness, and emotional precision that allows your voice to influence without force. You elevate your presence when your tone becomes confident, your words become clear, and your delivery becomes grounded in emotional intelligence. You gain influence when your communication builds trust, strengthens clarity, and transforms complexity into simplicity that anyone can understand. You rise in authority when your ability to listen becomes as strong as your ability to speak, making every conversation deeper, smarter, and more connected. You elevate your impact when your communication reflects calmness, thoughtfulness, and strategic intention instead of impulse or ego. You grow in mastery when every word you choose has purpose, every pause has power, and every sentence supports your identity as a clear and confident communicator. You gain psychological advantage when you understand the emotional patterns behind communication and use them to strengthen connection rather than weaken it. You rise in intelligence when your communication style reflects maturity, self-awareness, and empathy. You elevate your charisma when your presence feels reassuring, strong, and genuinely attentive. You grow in leadership when your communication influences hearts and minds with calm authority. You gain respect when people trust your clarity, admire your steadiness, and appreciate your ability to articulate ideas with grace. You rise in conversational dominance when your communication carries weight, meaning, and direction. You elevate your future when smart communication becomes your default setting. You grow into your fullest potential when your voice becomes a tool of intelligence, not emotion. And if this audiobook empowered you, make sure you subscribe to Frema Audiobooks, like this video, comment your biggest insights, and share this message with someone who wants to master powerful, intelligent communication, because great communicators are not born, they are built.